It was a quiet, ordinary day at the spaceport. Human trader Daniel Carter had just finished loading the last of his cargo onto his modest freighter. The place wasn't particularly bustling. Just a few scattered ships and their crews preparing for their next journeys. Daniel liked it that way. Fewer people meant fewer chances for trouble. As he turned toward his ship's ramp, a faint noise caught his attention. He stopped and looked around, unsure of what he had heard. Then, from the corner of his eye, he noticed someone stepping out of the shadows. She was alien. That much was obvious. Her long silver hair shimmered faintly in the artificial lights, and her deep violet eyes locked onto him with a strange mixture of hope and desperation. Her slender frame was wrapped in what looked like an old, tattered cloak. She moved slowly, cautiously, as if she feared she might startle him. "Please," she said, her voice soft but steady. "Please, take me with you. I will do anything." Daniel blinked. He hadn't expected this. A random alien pleading for passage wasn't something he encountered every day. He raised a hand, trying to keep his voice calm. "Hold on. Who are you? Why are you asking me for help?" The alien woman dropped her gaze to the ground. "My name is Lorana. I have no one left. Nowhere to go." Her voice trembled, but she stood her ground. "I will serve you. Do whatever you ask. Just take me away from here." Daniel glanced around. There were a few dockworkers nearby, but they weren't paying attention. The rest of the port seemed still. He rubbed the back of his neck, uneasy. "What's chasing you?" he asked. "Why can't you just get on another ship?" Lorana hesitated. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Instead, she held up her wrist. At first, Daniel didn't understand, but as he looked closer, he noticed a faint mark, a brand, etched into her skin. It didn't look natural. Something about it sent a chill down his spine. Before he could ask more, she stepped closer. Her voice dropped to a whisper. "I don't have time to explain. They'll find me. Please, I'm begging you." Her violet eyes shimmered with unshed tears. Daniel sighed, glancing at his ship. He didn't trust her, not yet, but something in her expression, in the way she stood there despite her fear, made him pause. "All right," he said finally. "Get inside. But you better tell me what's really going on." Lorana nodded quickly and hurried up the ramp. Daniel followed, his thoughts racing. He knew he might be inviting trouble, but he couldn't just leave her there. Not when she looked so human in her own alien way, and not when she seemed so completely alone. Inside the freighter, Daniel guided Lorana toward a small cabin in the back. The space wasn't much, just a fold-out cot, a storage locker, and a single overhead light, but it would do for now. Lorana sat down quietly, clutching her cloak around her. She didn't meet his eyes. Daniel leaned against the doorway, crossing his arms. "All right, we're in the clear for now. No one followed us out of the spaceport, but I need some answers." His voice was firm, but not harsh. "What's really going on? Why is someone after you?" Lorana hesitated, her gaze fixed on the floor. For a moment, Daniel thought she wouldn't respond. Then she took a deep breath and began to speak. I come from a planet called Selvaris. My people were once a proud race, known for our beauty and grace, but we were betrayed." She glanced up at Daniel, her violet eyes filled with a mix of sadness and anger. "Years ago, another faction in the galaxy wanted control over our resources. They launched a brutal campaign against us. Our leaders were captured or killed. Those of us who survived were scattered, hunted down like animals. I am one of the last." Her voice trembled. "And that mark on my wrist, it identifies me as a fugitive, a runaway. If the bounty hunters find me, they'll—" Daniel held up a hand, stopping her. "All right, I get it. You've been through hell." He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "But why come to me? Why ask me to take you in?" Lorana hesitated again, her fingers tracing the edge of her cloak. "Humans have a reputation. You're resourceful, clever, And she hesitated, searching for the right words. You have a kindness I don't see in most other species. I thought, maybe you would help me. Daniel shook his head. You're putting a lot of faith in someone you just met. I don't have a choice, Lorena said simply. Her words struck something in him. She was right. She had nothing. No family, no allies, no safe place to run. He still didn't trust her completely, but he couldn't deny the sincerity in her voice. Something about her situation felt genuine. And despite himself, he felt a small spark of determination. If she really was being hunted, he couldn't just turn a blind eye. That wasn't who he was. Fine, he said after a long pause. You can stay for now. But if I find out you're hiding something. I'm not, she interrupted, looking him straight in the eyes. I swear. Daniel nodded, pushing off the doorframe. We'll see. For now, get some rest. You look like you haven't slept in days. Lorena offered a small, grateful smile, though it barely reached her eyes. As Daniel walked back toward the cockpit, he couldn't help but feel he'd just stepped into something far more dangerous than he realized. The freighter hummed softly as it cruised through the vast, star-filled expanse of space. Daniel sat at the controls, staring at the endless void, his thoughts spinning as he tried to make sense of the situation. Every now and then, he glanced at the monitor to ensure they weren't being tracked. So far, no signs of pursuit, but he knew better than to relax just yet. In the cabin, Lorena sat quietly on the cot, still clutching her cloak. She hadn't said much since their hurried departure. Her violet eyes remained fixed on the wall, as if lost in a memory she didn't want to revisit. She looked fragile in that moment, almost ghost-like, but Daniel knew she was carrying a heavy burden. He just didn't know what it was. At least not yet. Hungry? Daniel asked, standing in the doorway. She flinched at his voice, as if startled. He held up a small meal pack. It's not gourmet, but it'll keep you going. Lorena hesitated before nodding. She reached out slowly, taking the pack from him. Thank you. Daniel pulled the folding chair from the corner and sat across from her. He studied her for a moment, trying to read her expression. Look, he started, keeping his tone even. I get that you don't trust me yet. I get that you're scared. But if we're going to survive this, I need you to level with me. If someone's after you, I need to know who they are and why. Otherwise, I can't help you. Lorena opened the pack and took a small bite, chewing carefully. Her hands were still trembling. After swallowing, she said quietly, They're called the Scaran Syndicate. They hunt people like me. People like you. Daniel raised an eyebrow. You mean survivors of your race? She nodded. The Syndicate was hired after the war ended. Their job is to ensure no Seraphis descendants survive. It's a contract they've held for years. Her voice grew quieter. They're thorough. They have no mercy. Daniel frowned. He'd heard of the Scaran Syndicate before. Merciless bounty hunters with a reputation for efficiency. They didn't care who they were hunting, only that they got paid. If Lorena was telling the truth, this wasn't just about her survival. She was part of something bigger, something dangerous. And what about that mark? He asked, pointing to her wrist. How'd you get it? She hesitated, her violet eyes meeting his for the first time. It's a tracking brand. They use it to identify escaped targets. Even if I change my appearance, even if I go into hiding, the mark makes it easy for them to find me. Daniel leaned back, exhaling. Great, so not only do they want you dead, but you've got a built-in homing beacon. Lorena's face fell. I understand if you want to leave me somewhere safe. I won't hold it against you. Daniel shook his head. No way. I don't abandon people. We'll figure this out. He stood, giving her a faint smile. But next time, you tell me the whole story sooner. Deal. She nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. Deal. After their tense conversation, the ship settled into an uneasy calm. Daniel worked in the cockpit, glancing occasionally at the radar display. The Scaran Syndicate's reputation weighed on his mind. If they were after Lorana, they wouldn't stop until they found her. He couldn't help but wonder if taking her on board was the worst decision he'd ever made. But every time he considered turning back, her face, filled with quiet desperation, flashed in his memory. He wasn't the kind of man to leave someone behind, even if it meant risking his own neck. Lorana stayed in the small cabin, mostly silent. Daniel brought her water and another meal pack, but she barely touched it. Instead, she spent her time staring at the wall or inspecting the brand on her wrist, her expression heavy with fear and guilt. When Daniel tried to talk to her again, she gave short, simple answers. He decided to give her some space. After a few hours, Daniel went to check on her. This time, Lorana looked up at him as he entered. "I'm sorry," she said softly. Her voice carried a weight that made him pause. "You shouldn't have to deal with this." "You think that's going to change anything?" Daniel asked, leaning against the doorframe. "You're here now. We'll deal with it." She shook her head. "You don't understand what the syndicate is like. They'll keep coming. They'll never stop until—" She trailed off, her eyes darting away. "Until you're dead," Daniel finished bluntly. Her silence confirmed it. He crossed his arms and sighed. "Well, good news is they haven't found us yet. Bad news is, I'm pretty sure we're running on borrowed time. We need a plan." Lorana frowned, her delicate hands twisting the edge of her cloak. "What kind of plan?" "For starters, we need to get rid of that tracker on your wrist," he said. "You said it marks you as a target, right? If we can remove it, we can at least make it harder for them to find you." Lorana's expression tightened. "It's not that simple. The mark isn't just on the surface. It's embedded, connected to my physiology. It's painful to remove." "Painful doesn't mean impossible," Daniel countered. "We're going to find someone who knows how to deal with it. Maybe a tech expert on a backwater colony. Someone who doesn't ask questions." Lorana's eyes searched his face, as if trying to see if he was serious. "Why are you doing this?" she asked quietly. "Why do you care?" Daniel scratched his head. "I don't know. Maybe I'm just tired of running cargo and pretending not to notice people who need help." He shrugged. "Or maybe I just think the syndicate deserves a good kick in the teeth. Either way, you're here, and I'm not leaving you to fend for yourself." A faint smile touched her lips, barely there, but enough to make Daniel feel he was doing the right thing. Days passed as Daniel and Lorana traveled through quiet star lanes, staying off well-known routes. The tension on board eased slightly, though Daniel knew it wouldn't last forever. He could see it in her eyes, the way she never fully relaxed, always glancing toward the doorway or shifting her weight, as if she were ready to run at a moment's notice. To break the silence one evening, Daniel decided it was time to get her involved. He found her sitting cross-legged in the cabin, fiddling with a small broken device. He knocked on the open doorway. "You know, if you're gonna sit there staring at that thing, you might as well come up to the cockpit and make yourself useful." Lorana blinked, looking up at him. "You want me to help?" "Why not?" he replied, leaning against the frame. "You're stuck on this ship for now, and I could use a co-pilot. Unless you'd rather stay here all day." She hesitated before nodding. Daniel watched as she followed him to the cockpit, still cautious. But when he handed her a basic navigational tablet and showed her how to track their route, her expression softened a little. Lorana had a sharp mind, and it didn't take her long to grasp the controls. She began asking questions about the ship's systems, the navigation grid, even the hyperspace coordinates he chose. As they worked together, Daniel started to notice small changes. She seemed more alert, more focused. The fear in her eyes wasn't gone, but it was no longer the only thing there. Curiosity crept in, and with it, the faintest hint of confidence. "Where did you learn all this?" she asked, tapping on the screen to correct their course. Daniel grinned. "Mostly the hard way. Running cargo isn't as simple as it sounds. Sometimes you have to get creative, especially when things go wrong. And let me tell you, things go wrong a lot." Lorana tilted her head slightly. Creative. That's something my people never really valued. Everything was always by tradition, by protocol. Sounds boring, Daniel said with a shrug. She almost smiled. It was. The conversation faltered for a moment. But then Lorana asked, Do you think it's possible to start over? To rebuild, even after everything has been taken from you? Daniel's hands paused over the controls. He thought about his own life, about losing his family, about the years he spent wandering from one job to the next. He didn't have a grand answer. All he had was the truth. Yeah, he said, but it's not easy, and it takes more than one person. You need people you can trust. Lorana looked down at her hands. She didn't say anything, but Daniel saw the faintest flicker of hope in her expression. Maybe, just maybe, she was starting to believe that she wasn't entirely alone anymore. Daniel and Lorana spent their days drifting between quiet star systems, keeping a low profile. The Scaran Syndicate had not yet appeared on their radar, but Daniel knew that didn't mean they weren't out there. He remained watchful, always double-checking his ship's systems and scanning for any unusual signals. Lorana, meanwhile, was beginning to find her footing aboard the freighter. She was no longer the silent, withdrawn figure Daniel had first met. Though still cautious, she had grown more comfortable working alongside him. The daily routine of adjusting navigation charts, running maintenance checks, and preparing simple meals gave her a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. One quiet afternoon, as Daniel repaired a faulty power relay in the engine room, Lorana approached him holding a datapad. I've been studying the ship's records, she said, her tone more confident than he expected. There's a small outpost on the edge of this sector. They specialize in low-profile tech repairs. I think they might be able to remove the tracking mark. Daniel set down his tools, wiping grease from his hands. You sure about that? I don't want to walk into a trap. It's a remote place, Lorana explained. Barely on the maps. I doubt the Syndicate would bother keeping watch there. Besides, they don't ask too many questions. He considered her words, his brow furrowed in thought. The idea of removing the mark was tempting. It would mean they could finally stop running. But it also meant taking a risk, landing on an unfamiliar outpost and trusting strangers with something this delicate. All right, Daniel said finally. We'll check it out. But if anything seems off, we leave. No questions, no second guesses. Lorana nodded. Agreed. With a course set, the freighter changed direction. Lorana felt a mix of hope and anxiety as the outpost came into view hours later. It was little more than a collection of weathered structures clinging to an asteroid, far from any major trade routes. The kind of place where people kept to themselves. They docked quietly, and Daniel made sure to carry a sidearm under his jacket. The pair stepped onto the dimly lit platform, their boots echoing faintly. A short, grizzled technician met them at the airlock. He barely glanced at Lorana, focusing instead on Daniel's brief explanation. I need a mark removed, Daniel said, holding up Lorana's wrist. The technician squinted at the faint glow of the embedded tracker. Tricky, the man muttered, scratching his chin. But doable. Costs extra if it's deep. Daniel handed over a handful of credits. Just get it done. The technician led them into a cramped workshop filled with humming machinery. Lorana sat down on a makeshift bench, her hands trembling slightly. The man worked quickly, mumbling to himself as he used a delicate instrument to deactivate the mark. It wasn't painless. Lorana winced as the device sparked against her skin, but within minutes, the faint glow disappeared. The mark was gone. She stared at her wrist, a mixture of disbelief and relief washing over her. Done, the technician grunted, stepping back. No more tracker. Just don't bring any trouble my way. As they returned to the ship, Lorana looked at Daniel. Thank you, she said softly. For the first time since they'd met, her voice carried a small note of hope. Daniel offered a faint smile. Don't thank me yet. We're not out of the woods. but at least we're one step closer. With the tracker removed, Lorana felt an unexpected sense of freedom. For so long, that glowing mark had been a reminder of everything she had lost: her home, her people, and any hope of a normal life. Now, it was gone. She found herself watching the stars outside the ship's window, the vast expanse of space feeling less like a prison and more like a second chance. Daniel noticed the subtle shift in her demeanor. She still moved carefully, still avoided the main corridors when he was working, but her eyes carried a different light now. They didn't dart nervously to every shadow, and she no longer flinched at every unexpected sound. One morning, while Daniel was running a diagnostic on the ship's main systems, Lorana quietly approached him. "What happens next?" she asked. Daniel turned, glancing at her over his shoulder. "What do you mean?" "I mean, now that the tracker is gone, we're not being hunted. At least, not the same way. Where do we go? What do we do?" He frowned, thinking about it. "Well, that depends. You're free to go wherever you want now. You could find a quiet colony, start over, or if there's something else you've been looking for." He shrugged. "It's up to you." Lorana's brow furrowed. "You're just going to drop me off somewhere. Would you rather stick around?" Daniel asked, leaning back in his chair. "Look, I'm not the kind of guy who settles down in one place. I keep moving, take jobs where I can. Not exactly a stable life." "I don't mind that," she said, surprising herself with how quickly the words came out. I've never really had stability, not the kind you're talking about. I don't know if I'd know what to do with it." She hesitated. "But I don't want to go back to being alone. Not yet." Daniel studied her for a moment. He wasn't used to people wanting to stay with him. Most of the time, he worked solo, kept his distance, and made sure not to get too attached. But Lorana had proven herself. She wasn't just a helpless passenger anymore. She was sharp, eager to learn, and more capable than she gave herself credit for. "Well," he said slowly, "if you're serious about sticking around, you'll need to keep pulling your weight. No freeloaders on my ship." He gave her a teasing smirk. "Think you're up for it?" Lorana managed a small smile. "I'll do my best." "Good," Daniel replied. He turned back to the console, his fingers flying over the controls. "In that case, let's find some work. Something low profile, but enough to keep us going." As the ship's engines hummed to life, Lorana took her seat beside him. She still didn't know where their path would lead, but for the first time in years, she didn't feel completely lost. Over the next few days, Lorana and Daniel fell into a routine. He taught her the ins and outs of the ship's systems, how to monitor the fuel reserves, and even how to make minor repairs. At first, she hesitated. She'd never been allowed to touch machinery on her homeworld. But with Daniel's patient guidance, she grew more confident. Soon she could handle small tasks on her own, and each success brought a little more color to her cheeks. Daniel, meanwhile, found himself surprised at how quickly she adapted. She wasn't just a fast learner. She had a knack for spotting problems before they happened. Once, while they were prepping the ship for hyperspace, she pointed out a subtle fluctuation in the engine's output. He checked it, expecting nothing, but she was right. A quick adjustment later, the ship hummed smoothly. "How'd you catch that?" Daniel asked, his tone both curious and impressed. "I don't know," Lorana replied with a small shrug. "It just felt off." "Well, keep it up," he said. "You might save our skins one day." Lorana smiled at the compliment, though she quickly hid it by turning back to her work. The freighter's interior, once filled with a tense silence, now buzzed with quiet activity. Lorana no longer spent all her time in the cabin. Instead, she joined Daniel in the cockpit or the engine room, always asking questions, always eager to learn. And as the ship became more familiar to her, so did the man who captained it. She found Daniel's gruff exterior hiding a dry sense of humor, and his blunt words often carried more care than he let on. When she struggled to tighten a bolt, he'd simply take the wrench, show her the right angle, and hand it back with a small nod. He never scolded her, never raised his voice. It was a kind of teaching she wasn't used to, one that encouraged her to keep trying instead of shrinking away. For his part, Daniel found that Lorana's presence brought a kind of stability he hadn't expected. He'd spent years working alone, keeping others at arm's length. But Lorana wasn't just another passenger. She was becoming a partner, someone who shared the workload, and in her quiet way, pushed him to be better. One evening, after a long day of repairs and charting their next course, they sat in the cockpit staring out at the stars. Lorana broke the silence. "Do you ever think about what it would be like to just stay in one place? To stop running?" Daniel raised an eyebrow, glancing at her. "Sometimes, but then I remember how boring that sounds." Lorana laughed, a soft, genuine sound that lit up her face. It was the first time Daniel had heard her laugh. He smirked and turned back to the stars. "Well," she said after a moment, "I don't think I'd be bored. Not if you're around." Daniel didn't reply, but a faint grin tugged at his lips. For the first time in a long while, he didn't mind the company. One day, as Daniel and Lorana were fine-tuning the ship's navigation system, an unexpected alert popped up on the console. Daniel frowned, leaning closer to the screen. "That's strange," he muttered. "What is it?" Lorana asked, standing beside him. "A distress signal," he said. "It's faint, but it's coming from nearby." He tapped a few buttons, narrowing down the coordinates. "Looks like a small freighter. Could be a broken transmitter, or maybe someone really needs help." Lorana glanced at him, her violet eyes filled with uncertainty. "Should we investigate? What if it's a trap?" Daniel hesitated. Normally, he would have ignored it and kept moving. He'd learned the hard way that stopping to help could get you killed, or worse. But something about having Lorana here changed his perspective. She had needed help once, and he'd given it. Maybe it was time to pay that forward. "We'll be careful," he said finally. "No one's forcing us to land. We'll just take a closer look." The two of them worked quickly, adjusting their course and preparing the ship's modest defenses. As they approached the source of the signal, a battered freighter came into view. Its hull was scorched, parts of it riddled with holes. It was clearly in bad shape, drifting aimlessly in space. "Looks like it went through a fight," Daniel said, his hand hovering near the comm controls. "I'll hail them first." He opened a channel, speaking clearly. "Unidentified freighter, this is the Star Warden. We received your distress signal. Do you require assistance?" For a moment, there was no reply. Then, a crackling voice came through. "This is the freighter Oriole. We've taken heavy damage. Systems failing. Need help." Daniel exchanged a glance with Lorana. The voice sounded weak, genuine, but he still couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. "We'll stay at a distance and see what we can do," he replied over the comm. "Stand by." As the Star Warden drifted closer, Daniel kept a sharp eye on the sensors. "No other ships in the area," he noted aloud. "If it's a trap, it's a subtle one." Lorana frowned. "What do we do?" Daniel considered his options. "We'll scan for life signs. If there are people on board and they're in trouble, we'll help. If not, we'll move on." They ran a quick scan, and the results surprised them. Only one faint life sign registered on the damaged ship. "Just one survivor," Daniel said. "Whoever's left must be barely hanging on." Lorana leaned closer to the screen. "They could die if we don't help." Daniel sighed, his hand hovering over the controls. He knew the risks, but he couldn't ignore someone in need. "All right," he said, locking in a docking course. "Let's get them out of there." As the ship slowly approached the crippled freighter, Daniel glanced at Lorana. "If this goes sideways, you head back here and seal the doors." "Got it." She nodded, a look of determination on her face. "Got it." And with that, they prepared to board the drifting ship, ready to face whatever waited inside. As the docking clamps engaged, Daniel grabbed his tool belt and a small plasma cutter, just in case they needed to pry a hatch open. Lorana stayed close behind, a slight frown creasing her brow. The Star Warden was secure, but the damaged freighter ahead looked worse up close, its hull scarred by what must have been heavy weapon fire. "Stay sharp," Daniel said as the airlock opened. Inside, the ship was eerily silent. The lighting flickered, casting long, shifting shadows along the narrow corridors. Daniel's boots clanged against the metal floor as he moved forward, scanning for the faint life sign they detected earlier. Lorana followed quietly, her violet eyes scanning every corner. After a few turns, they reached a room that looked like the freighter's control center. The panels were fried, the main console blackened and sparking faintly. In the corner of the room lay a figure, a humanoid motionless. Lorana gasped softly and knelt beside the body. "They're alive," she said, her hand hovering over their shoulder. "Barely." Daniel crouched down to get a better look. The survivor was a young man, his uniform shredded and smeared with soot. His breathing was shallow, and his face was pale, but he was alive. Daniel sighed, reaching into his pack for a small medkit. "We'll stabilize him here, then get him back to the ship," Daniel said. "No sense staying in this wreck any longer than we have to." Lorana nodded, helping as Daniel patched the man's wounds and injected a quick-acting stim to keep him stable. As they worked, the freighter groaned, the metal structure creaking under some unseen pressure. "This ship isn't going to hold much longer," Lorana said, glancing at the cracked walls. "We need to move fast." Daniel agreed. Lifting the survivor gently, he motioned for Lorana to lead the way back. They moved carefully but quickly, retracing their steps toward the Star Warden. The creaks and groans of the freighter grew louder, more ominous. As they reached the airlock, the freighter shuddered violently. Sparks erupted from the walls, and one of the bulkheads crumpled inward. Lorana yelped, grabbing hold of the doorway for balance. Daniel tightened his grip on the injured man and pushed through the airlock. "Get us undocked, now," Daniel shouted as they reached the Star Warden's cockpit. Lorana darted to the controls, her fingers flying over the interface. Within seconds, the docking clamps released, and the Star Warden's engines roared to life. They pulled away just as the freighter's structure collapsed, pieces of debris scattering into space. Once they were safely away, Daniel set the unconscious man down on a cot and turned to Lorana. "You did good back there," he said, a faint smile on his lips. She exhaled heavily, her shoulders relaxing. "We saved him." Daniel nodded, looking back at the drifting debris. "Yeah, we did. And now we keep moving." With that, they settled back into the Star Warden's familiar hum, ready to face whatever the stars threw at them next.